Good evening and welcome to tonight's video. I'd like to start by thanking everybody who participated in last week's poll to decide what tonight's video would be. There was a very clear winner. 50% of the votes were for the mystical quest in Freemasonry. So here we go. The copy that I have of this work is both undated and anonymous, but research leads me to believe that it's most probably by the famous Arthur Edward Waite. Certainly the writing style is very reminiscent of Waite's. It's quite dense and prolix, and for reasons of time I have edited some fairly significant chunks from the text that will be presented tonight. If you'd like to read the full text, a quick Google search of the mystical quest in Freemasonry will show that copies of this exist on quite a few Masonic sites.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
By the general agreement of Masonic students today, the history of speculative Freemasonry is considered to commence with the formation of the London Grand Lodge on the 24th of June 1717. But I wish to emphasize that although this data is accepted because it marks the beginning of an organized plan for the development of what is now the English Masonic Constitution, it must not be overlooked that the transition of the craft from operative to speculative was a gradual process, taking place both before and after the inauguration of the Grand Lodge. At the beginning of the 18th century, Masonic lodges in England, Scotland, and Ireland were composed of operatives as well as speculative, and notwithstanding the fact that by this time the greater number were undoubtedly speculative Freemasons, the operative element was by no means eliminated. This was the period when the craft of Masonry was transformed, and the final result was the emergence in the year 1723 of speculative Freemasonry proclaiming itself as a system of morality presented in the form of ritual and veiling its instruction by recourse to allegory and symbolism. A close study of the historical setting prior to the emergence of the speculative order will disclose to the student that the original founders saw with clear vision and foresight that the operative craft guilds had outlived their sphere of usefulness as a trade organization, but that at the same time they were capable of placing a ready-made machinery complete with an elementary symbolism on which to graft matters of a highly esoteric and mystical nature. I have deemed it advisable to draw your attention to these facts in order to illustrate that emblematic Freemasonry incorporates doctrine and symbolism divided into two distinct classes: ethical and moral, derived from the operative craft and the technical equipment of a workman in material stone, and mystical and philosophical, transmitted from less public organizations of mystics and occultists and having no relation to the practical building tradee. The wisdom of the incorporated system lies in the recognition that both classes of symbolism and instruction have one characteristic in common. They both refer to man, his nature, his destiny, and the course he must follow in order to fulfill that nature and attain his true destiny. Freemasonry, therefore, acknowledges, as the writer Pope expressed it in his celebrated essays, that the proper study of mankind is man, and we find this same principle set forth in the third degree, in the instruction to the candidate to guide his reflections to that most interesting of all human studies, the knowledge of himself. The system we know as craft Freemasonry was especially designed to teach self-knowledge, but this involves a knowledge much deeper, vaster, and more difficult than is popularly conceived, and therefore, before the individual Freemason is in the position to reduce its implications into personal experience, he must have the ability to understand the meaning of all that has been communicated to him, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. I must now ask you to concentrate your attention for a few moments on the ceremonies of opening and closing the lodge in the third degree. You will recall that in the case of the ceremony of opening the lodge, that so great is the zeal of those who are presumed to be engaged in the search that they have covered the symbolical distance between cosmic east and west in order to participate. Now, by way of contrast, we find that in the ceremony of closing the lodge, the symbolical journey is reversed, being now from west to east. From this, it is quite clear that the intention is to show that in the Master Mason degree, the measures of possibility have been spanned, and that henceforth the fulfillment or recovery rests with Providence, watching within the veil of futurity. In what light do we Freemasons regard the content of these two brief ceremonies of opening and closing the lodge? It may surprise some of you who have listened to in lodge on many occasions to the recitation of the ritual catechism to learn that it is a modern version of what is known in mysticism as the quest formula, and thus is the reflection of a highly mystical doctrine. Its correspondence in mysticism is in fact the age-old theosophical doctrine concerning the eternal east of our antenatal life, which is forfeited by the descent of the soul into generation as on a journey to the west, or into manifested being and the grave of the flesh. The way of resurrection from the grave is proclaimed to be that of return whence we came. The quest formula is exceedingly old in folklore, and the presence of the doctrine incorporated in the ritual of the third degree throws a flood of light upon that which is presented heavily veiled in allegory in the ceremony of raising. It also provides the key to that obscure passage in the ritual when the attention of the candidate is directed to a retrospect of those degrees in Freemasonry through which he has already passed. Let us reflect a little upon these things and express them in language with which, as Freemasons, we are all familiar. We have been taught that our admission into Freemasonry was an emblematical representation of the entrance of all men upon their mortal existence. What bearing has this on the problem of self-knowledge? Surely we may quickly grasp that it is an emphatic answer to that deep, persistent questioning which presents itself to every thinking mind. Whence come I? The answer is luminous in ritual terms. Each of us, we are told, has come from that mystical East, the eternal source of all light and life, and our life here is described as being spent in the West, that is, in a world which is the antipodes of our original home. Hence every candidate, upon admission, is placed in a state of darkness in the west of the lodge. Thereby, he is repeating symbolically the incident of his actual birth into this world, which he entered as a blind and helpless babe, and through which in his early years, not knowing whither he was going, after many stumblings and irregular steps, after many tribulations and adversities incident to human life, he may at length ascend, chastened by experience, to larger life in the eternal East. But in the Master Mason degree, the first section of the third lecture, the question is put, as a Master Mason, whence came you? And the answer is that he came from the East. For by this time the Freemason is deemed to have so enlarged his knowledge as to realize that the primal source of life is not in this world, that existence on this planet is but a transitory journey, and that he must return from this temporary world to that East from which he originally came. I trust that it is now possible for you to glean that, in its highest understanding, the doctrine of Freemasonry tells us that the soul of man comes forth from an eternal centre, and that the soul in fine, goes back, or to that point within circle, from which the Master Mason cannot err. It is in this sense that, as Master Masons, we are intended to realize that the pageant of the third degree is our own story, told in another manner of language and shadowed forth in other types. We are also pursuing the search for that which is lost, and we have been raised in the shadow, that we may be brought thereafter into a great light, at once a morning star and orient, which visits us from on high. It now remains for me to show that the key to the whole purpose of the Masonic system is contained in the central legend and the traditional history of the third degree, and that it is this key which is missing in the majority of cases when brethren have sought to elucidate the mystery. To many members of our order, the story of the building of the Temple at Jerusalem appears to be the history of an actual structure of stone and mortar, erected by a famous Hebrew king, assisted in the work by another king, who supplied the men and materials, and by a principal architect, who supplied the preordained plans to the craftsmen. But we must be very careful before we come to any such conclusions regarding this temple, and we must also bear in mind that the Masonic legend informs us that during the course of the work of erection, a conspiracy arose among the workmen, preventing the completion of the building, which therefore remains unfinished to this day. I will ask you to note that this legend cannot refer to any historical building erected in the old metropolis of Palestine, for if we refer to the volume of the Sacred Law as an authority for the Temple at Jerusalem, we find it recorded that the temple was completed. Moreover, the account given in the volume of the Sacred Law makes no reference whatever to the conspiracy among the workmen, but on the contrary, it is expressly stated in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 11, "And Huram finished the work that he was to make for King Solomon for the house of God." And we are further informed that the temple was finished and completed in every particular. The Masonic legend further instructs us that by the death of the principal architect, secrets were lost. Now it is obvious that the principles of architecture, the genuine secrets of the building trade, are not and never have been lost. They are thoroughly well known, and it is absurd to suppose that Masons of any kind are waiting for time or circumstances to restore any lost knowledge as to the manner in which temporal buildings ought to be constructed. Clearly our duty is to pierce the veil of allegory contained in the legend, and by so doing grasp the significance of its true purport. That which is lost is to be found, we are told, within the centre, but if we inquire what is a centre, we are confronted with an enigmatic answer. If we ask also, why with the centre, we are again faced with a perplexing answer. The truth is that these questions and answers are typical examples of an intentional puzzle language which is used to stimulate investigation into the deeper things which lie beyond the literal words. The method is one that is common to all systems of initiations, and the clue to its adoption in our system will be found by a reference to the lecture on the tracing board in the first degree, where it is affirmed that philosophers, unwilling to expose their mysteries to vulgar eyes, concealed their tenets and principles of polity and philosophy under hieroglyphical figures. The traditional history of the third degree constitutes just such an hieroglyphical figure. From what I have already disclosed, it follows that the legend of the third degree deals with something quite distinct from the construction of a material edifice, and I need only add that the temple of speculative Freemasonry is that holy temple of which all material edifices are but the types and symbols. It is that temple of the collective body of humanity referred to by St. Paul in the first book of Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, in the words, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" And of which he also declared, "According to the grace of God, which is given unto me, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10. A perfect humanity was the great temple, which in the councils of the Most High was intended to be reared in the mystical holy city, the city of eternal peace, of which the local Jerusalem was the type. The three master builders, King Solomon and the two Hirims, are a triad corresponding to the trinities to be found in all the great world religions. It is hardly necessary to remark that the builders of this temple of the Most High were not three human personages, and we should realize that their names are a personification of the divine creative energy, considered in its three constituent principles, which are symbolized in our ritual as pillars of his work, namely wisdom, strength, and beauty. Those of you who are versed in metaphysics will recognize that these three metaphysical principles form the basis of all created things and may be defined for our purpose of study in more modern terms. Wisdom, the life essence, otherwise the breath of life. Strength, primordial substance, or that which translated from the Hebrew of the volume of the sacred law as dust of the ground, into which the Lord of life, God, breathed the breath of life. It is therefore a mould or vehicle of the life essence, and is termed in our modern nomenclature the soul, which gives form or objectiveness. Beauty, the intellectual principle which is built into the soul, and which energizes and binds the life essence and the substance together and constitutes the whole of an intelligent instrument. It was of these three principles, or in the words of our ritual, of these divine attributes, that the human soul was originally and divinely built, and thus the temple of the collective soul of humanity was made, or built, of the three constituent principles of deity, in due balance and proportion, perfect in all its parts. And the work was divinely pronounced to be very good, as in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The material of the mystical temple at Jerusalem was therefore the souls of men, who were at once the living stones, the fellow craftsmen, and collaborators with the divine purpose. But in the course of the construction of this ideal temple, something happened that wrecked the scheme and delayed the fulfillment indefinitely. If you will consult the book of Genesis in the volume of the Sacred Law, you will find the same subject related in the allegory of Adam and Eve. They were intended, as you are aware, for perfection and happiness, but the project of the Creator became nullified by their disobedience to certain conditions which were imposed upon them. You will observe that their offence was precisely the same as that committed by our Masonic conspirators. They had been forbidden to eat of the tree of knowledge, or, in Masonic language, they were under obligation not to attempt to extort the secrets of a superior degree to which they had not attained. In our Masonic system, the ruffians are represented as demanding the secrets of the master, or the secrets of his exalted degree, and they attempt to extort them by violence. The meaning of this becomes clear once it is understood that the translation of the Hebrew word Hiram is teacher of supreme knowledge, or, more correctly, it is the equivalent of the Sanskrit word Kuru, meaning literally teacher of the divine wisdom. The fellow crafts are therefore represented as endeavouring to obtain that knowledge which Hiram said was known to but three in the world, or in other words, knowledge that was known only in the councils of the Divine Trinity. In this parable, we are dealing with a moral disaster to universal humanity. The faculty of enlightened wisdom has been cut off from humanity. It is in this sense that the temple of human nature still remains unfinished, and it will do so until we recover the plans and designs which were formerly regularly supplied by the great architect of the universe. In our day, we have good reason to know that despite all the efforts and endeavours, we are still unable to regulate the disorders of individual and national life, and this indicates to us that some heavy calamity has befallen us as a race. It is also true that in our best moments we all long for that light and wisdom which has become lost to us, and, like the craftsman in search of the body, we go our different ways in search of what is lost. We seek it in pleasure, in work, and in varied occupations and diversions. We seek it in intellectual pursuits and in Freemasonry, and those who search farthest and deepest are those who become most conscious of the loss. Thus the search goes on, and in the divine providence we find that there still remains to us the glimmering ray in the east. In this manner, veiled in allegory, Freemasonry teaches us the great truth that it is humanity itself that is the living temple whose building in those far-off days became obstructed, and therefore, to all of us who have eyes to see and ears to hear, it conveys the emphatic message that we are both the craftsmen and the building materials of that edifice, which was intended to be an unparalleled structure, but which, although in foundation well and truly laid, has so far failed in the effort to raise a superstructure, perfect in all its parts and honourable to the builder. But let us not forget that while Freemasonry emphasises the utter confusion arising from the universal loss of the original plans and designs, its real purpose is to bear witness to the fact which has been taught in all subsequent ages, namely, that with proper instruction, and by our own patience and industry, we can regain that wisdom we have lost, and revive in ourselves the divine life essence which is the basis of our being. This brings us to the consideration of the most important matter. How can we regain the secrets? Deep at the centre of ourselves lies buried the vital and immortal principle that affiliates us to the divine centre of all life, and this is never wholly extinguished, however imperfect our lives may be. The lost guiding light is buried at the centre of ourselves. High as your hand can reach, upwards or downwards from the centre of your own body, for example 3 feet between north and south, as far as your hand can reach to the right or left from the middle of your person, for example 3 feet between the east and the west, and 5 feet or more perpendicular, the height of the human body. Freemasonry, then, is a system of philosophy inasmuch that it provides us with the doctrine of the universe and our place in it, indicates whence we are come and whither we may return. Its first purpose is to show that man has fallen away from a higher state to the externalized condition in which we now live, but its great virtue lies in the fact that to those who seek it, it indicates the way by which the centre may be found within ourselves, and the outline of this teaching is embodied in the discipline and ordeals brought to the notice of the candidate in the 3 degrees. The instruction of these degrees is veiled allegory and illustrated by symbols, to emphasize that all great symbols are shadowed forth in the person of man himself. Thus, the human organism is the true lodge that must be opened, and wherein the mysteries are to be found. Thus it is that in our lodge rooms are so furnished to typify the human organism, the lower and physical part of us earthy, and rests like a Jacob's ladder upon the earth, whilst our higher portion is spiritual and reaches to the heavens. These 2 portions are in perpetual conflict, and he alone is a wise man who has learned to effect a perfect balance between them and to establish himself in strength, so that his own inward house stands firm against all weakness and temptation. The world at large is, as it were, but one great lodge, of which our Masonic lodges are the little mirrors. Mother Earth is also the mother lodge of us all. As its vast work goes on, souls are ever descending into it, and souls are being called out of it at the knocks of some great unseen warden of life and death, who calls them from labour here and summons them hence for refreshment. Hence it is that after the work in the lodge, the festive board, after the labour of this world, the repast and refreshment of the heavenly places. In submitting these thoughts to you, I would once again stress the fact that the real aim of Freemasonry is to provide us with a course of self-knowledge and self-discipline by means of which we may accelerate our return to our real home, which in the volume of the Sacred Law is known as the Kingdom of Heaven. The candidate in the entered apprentice degree is informed that our system is one containing secrets, but he is also reminded that those secrets are not communicated indiscriminately. This is indeed true, for they exist concealed beneath a great reservation. Seek, and ye shall find. Ask, and ye shall receive. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. The search may be long and difficult, but great things are not to be acquired without effort, and it may be affirmed that to the candidate who is properly prepared, there are doors leading from the craft that, when knocked, will assuredly open and admit him to places and to knowledge of which he at present knows little.
For more Masonic podcasts, videos, music, texts, and artwork, visit fromthequarries.com or subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts by searching From the Quarries.